Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I came back from my military deployment to find out that my brother had not only stolen my wife, but also moved into the house I had been paying for. Now my parents are begging me to forgive them for the sake of family. How do you even begin to process that level of betrayal? After a grueling 12 months overseas, stepping off that plane felt like a dream. The weight of combat, the sleepless nights, and the constant fear of what could go wrong finally lifted as I set foot on home soil. All I could think about was Emma, her smile, her laugh, the way she used to light up when I walked through the door. I had been counting down the days to this moment, clinging to her in my mind like a lifeline. I was ready to pick up where we left off, to feel normal again. The ride from the airport to our house was surreal. I stared out the window, watching the familiar streets roll by. Everything looked the same, but I felt different, like I didn't belong here anymore. Still, the thought of Emma waiting for me kept me grounded. I had sent every spare dollar I earned to her, making sure our bills were paid and that she was comfortable. Lately, she had been distant on our calls, but I figured it was just the stress of my absence. Who wouldn't feel lonely with their husband gone for a year? When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed something odd right away. Emma's car was there, but the curtains in the living room were different. They were dark gray instead of the cheery floral ones we had picked out together. I shook it off, thinking she might have redecorated. I grabbed my duffel bag, walked up to the front door, and slid my key into the lock. It didn't turn. At first, I thought I must have made a mistake. I tried again, jiggling the key, but it still didn't work. Confused, I knocked on the door. A few seconds later, it swung open, and there stood Jake, my younger brother, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt like he had just rolled out of bed. "Jake!" I said, blinking in disbelief. "What the hell are you doing here?" His face went pale, and for a moment, I thought he might be just as shocked as I was. But then he glanced behind him, like he was trying to figure out what to say. Finally, he stepped outside, pulling the door almost closed behind him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and tense. That's when I noticed the nervous look in his eyes. It wasn't the kind of look you give someone when you've got good news. My heart started pounding in my chest. "Talk about what? Where's Emma?" Jake sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Look, man, I didn't plan for this to happen. It just happened. What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice rising. I pushed past him, determined to get inside and find Emma, but Jake grabbed my arm. "Wait," he said, but I wasn't about to wait for anything. I shoved him aside and stepped into the house. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It didn't smell like Emma's candles or her favorite vanilla-scented cleaner. It smelled like cheap cologne and takeout food. The living room was a mess. Beer bottles on the coffee table, a blanket draped over the couch that I didn't recognize. And then I saw her. Emma was coming down the stairs, wearing one of my old t-shirts. She froze when she saw me, her face a mix of shock and guilt. "Matt," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why is Jake here? Why doesn't my key work?" She hesitated, looking at Jake for help, but he stayed silent. Finally, she said, "I didn't want you to find out like this." "Find out what?" I yelled. "We're together," she said, her words hitting me like a punch to the gut. "Jake and I were in love." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. My own brother. My wife. I looked at Jake, hoping he'd tell me this was some kind of sick joke, but he just stood there avoiding my eyes. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, my voice breaking. "I've been over there, fighting for my life, and this is what I come home to." "It wasn't planned," Jake said, finally speaking up. "We didn't mean for it to happen. But you were gone for so long, Matt. She needed someone, and I was here." I stared at him in disbelief. "So what? You thought you'd just take my place?" Emma stepped closer, but I backed away. "I'm sorry," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want to hurt you. But we couldn't help it." "Couldn't help it?" I shouted. "You could have helped it by not betraying me." The room went silent, the air thick with tension. I looked at both of them, two people I had trusted more than anyone else in the world, and felt a wave of rage and despair like I'd never known. "I can't do this," I said, grabbing my bag and heading for the door. Jake tried to stop me, but I shoved him aside. As I walked out of the house I had worked so hard to provide, I felt like a stranger in my own life. My home, my marriage, my family, it was all gone, and I had no idea what to do next. For the first few minutes after leaving, I felt like I was outside my own body, watching the whole situation from some surreal, detached place. My brother and my wife. Together. It sounded like the plot of a bad movie, but it was my life now. As I sat in my truck parked down the street, staring blankly at the steering wheel, a storm of emotions began to hit me all at once. Rage, betrayal, heartbreak. How could they do this to me? I kept replaying the scene in my head. Emma standing on those stairs in my t-shirt, looking at me like I was the intruder. The way she said, I didn't plan for this to happen, like it was some random accident, as if she'd tripped and fallen into a relationship with Jake. But the worst part was Jake's face. The way he had looked at me, almost smug, like he had beaten me at some twisted game. You were gone for so long, man, he'd said, as if being deployed was a choice I made just to inconvenience him. I thought about turning the truck around and going back to confront them again. I had so many questions. When did this start? How long had they been sneaking around behind my back? Did they plan this while I was still home? But deep down, I knew I wouldn't get the answers I needed. They'd just throw more excuses at me, twist things to make themselves the victims. I couldn't deal with that right now. Instead, I drove to a nearby park and parked under a tree, trying to calm myself down. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emma and Jake together. The image was burned into my brain, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. I picked up my phone to call someone, anyone, but who could I talk to? My parents? They'd probably tell me to work it out because, family. My friends? Most of them were scattered across the country, people I'd met in the military who wouldn't really understand the depth of this betrayal. After what felt like hours of sitting there in silence, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself. I dialed my mom's number, and she picked up after the first ring. Matt! Oh, it's so good to hear from you. How was your flight? Did you surprise Emma? She asked, her voice full of excitement. I hesitated for a moment, unsure how to even begin. Finally, I said, Mom, I'm not at the house anymore. Something happened. What do you mean? What happened? She asked, her tone shifting to concern. It's Jake, I said, my voice trembling. He's with Emma. Like with her. They're together. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear my mom breathing, like she was trying to process what I had just said. Then she let out a shaky sigh. Oh, Matt? I was afraid this might happen. My blood ran cold. What do you mean you were afraid this might happen? You knew. Not exactly, she said quickly. It's just, Jake mentioned he was spending a lot of time with Emma while you were gone. He said he was helping her out, keeping her company. I didn't think it would go this far. But you didn't say anything to me? I snapped, my voice rising. You didn't think it was important to warn me that my wife and my brother were getting a little too close. Matt, calm down, she said, her voice pleading. I didn't want to upset you while you were overseas. You had enough to deal with. Yeah, well, now I'm dealing with this, I said bitterly. Thanks for the heads up, Mom. I hung up before she could say anything else. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to decide what to do next. I couldn't go back to the house, but I couldn't just sit here all night either. I needed answers, closure, something to help me make sense of this mess. Against my better judgment, I decided to go back. Not to talk to them, I couldn't stomach seeing their faces again so soon, but to grab a few things. My clothes, my laptop, anything that wasn't tainted by their betrayal. When I pulled into the driveway, the lights were still on, and I could see their shadows moving around inside. My stomach turned, but I forced myself out of the truck. I didn't bother knocking this time. I walked straight up to the door and banged on it hard enough to make the windows rattle. Jake opened the door, looking startled. Matt, what are you? I'm not here to talk, I said, cutting him off. I'm here to get my stuff. Stay out of my way. He stepped aside, looking like he wanted to say something, but I ignored him. Emma appeared in the hallway, her eyes red from crying. Matt, please, can we just talk about this? There's nothing to talk about, I said coldly. You made your choice. I stormed upstairs, heading straight for the bedroom. Seeing our bed, the bed I had shared with Emma, made my stomach churn. I grabbed my suitcase from the closet and started throwing my clothes into it, not bothering to fold anything. As I packed, I noticed that some of my things were missing. My favorite hoodie, a watch Emma had given me for our anniversary. Were they wearing my stuff while playing house together? The thought made me want to smash something. Jake appeared in the doorway as I was zipping up the suitcase. Matt, I know you're angry, but angry doesn't even begin to cover it, I said, cutting him off. You're my brother, Jake. My brother. How could you do this to me? He looked down at the floor, avoiding my eyes. I didn't mean for it to happen. I swear. Stop saying that, I snapped. You didn't mean for it to happen? What? Did you just trip and fall in her bed? His face turned red, but he didn't respond. I pushed past him, dragging my suitcase behind me. Emma was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, tears streaming down her face. Matt, please, she said, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. Funny, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Because you seem to have done a pretty good job of it. I walked out without looking back, slamming the door behind me. As I drove away, I felt a mix of anger and relief. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. I couldn't stay in this nightmare any longer. I spent the next few days in a haze, moving between anger and heartbreak like a pendulum. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emma and Jake together, laughing at my expense, living in the house I had built with my hard work. Sleep was out of the question, and every attempt at distraction failed miserably. I holed up in a cheap motel on the edge of town, too ashamed and furious to talk to anyone. It wasn't until the third day that I finally mustered the courage to call my parents. Part of me hoped they'd be furious on my behalf, that they'd march over to the house and demand answers from Jake. After all, what kind of parents wouldn't stand up for their son after something like this? But the sinking feeling in my gut told me not to expect much. When my mom picked up the phone, her voice was cheerful at first. "Matt, I've been wondering when you'd call. How's everything? Did you surprise Emma?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, I surprised her all right. She and Jake are together. Did you know that?" The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. After a long pause, my mom sighed heavily, like she'd been carrying a weight she was finally being forced to acknowledge. "Matt, I'm so sorry you found out this way." The way she said it, like this wasn't news to her, set my blood boiling. "So you knew?" I asked, my voice rising. "You knew, and you didn't think to tell me?" "It's not that simple," she said weakly. "We didn't want to hurt you while you were overseas. You had enough to worry about. Hurt me? You thought this would hurt less if I walked into it blind?" I snapped. "You let me come home to this without so much as a warning?" "We didn't think it would last," she said defensively. "We thought it was just a phase, something that would blow over before you got back." My chest tightened as her words sank in. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, barely able to contain my rage. "So what? You just hoped they'd break up, and I'd never have to know my wife and brother were sleeping together?" "Matt, please," she said, her voice trembling. "We didn't know what to do. It's a horrible situation, but Jake and Emma, they seem happy now. We were hoping you'd understand." "Understand?" I shouted. "Understand that my wife and my brother betrayed me? That you stood by and let it happen? How could you even say that to me?" My mom started crying, but I wasn't in the mood to comfort her. Before she could respond, my dad got on the phone. His tone was calmer, but somehow that made it worse. "Matt, listen," he said. "I know this is hard for you, but what's done is done. It's a messy situation, sure, but they didn't mean for it to happen." "That's the second time I've heard that excuse," I said coldly. "It doesn't make it better." "Look," my dad continued, "we're still a family. Jake's your brother. Emma, well, things didn't work out the way we all thought they would, but she's still family too, in a way. You can't just throw that away." "Are you serious right now?" I said, my voice shaking. "You're asking me to forgive them? To pretend this didn't happen so we can all have Christmas together or something?" "No one's saying you have to forgive them overnight," he said, trying to sound reasonable. "But holding on to all this anger isn't good for anyone. Maybe you could sit down with Jake and Emma, talk things out." "Talk things out?" I repeated, incredulous. "What do you expect me to say? Hey, thanks for ruining my life, but let's grab dinner sometime?" "Matt," my mom chimed in, still sniffling, "we just don't want to see the family fall apart over this. Jake made a mistake." "He didn't make a mistake. I cut her off. He made a choice. And so did Emma. They both knew exactly what they were doing. And so did you when you decided to keep it from me." The line went quiet for a moment, and I could hear my parents whispering to each other. Finally, my dad said, "You're angry right now, and that's understandable. But think about what you're saying. Do you really want to cut ties with your whole family over this?" I laughed bitterly. "You're acting like I'm the one who broke the family apart. Jake and Emma did that, and you went along with it. You chose them over me. So no, I'm not the one who ruined this family. We didn't choose sides," my mom said weakly. We didn't want to make things worse." "Well, congratulations," I said, "because you couldn't have made this worse if you tried." I hung up before they could respond. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone. I wanted to scream, to break something, to do anything to let out the rage that was boiling inside me. Instead, I sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring at the floor and wondering how I had ended up here. My own parents had known about this for months and hadn't said a word. They let me walk into a nightmare, completely unprepared, because they didn't want to deal with the fallout. And now they wanted me to forgive Jake and Emma for the sake of family. The betrayal cut deeper than I ever thought possible. I had lost my wife and my brother, and now I felt like I had lost my parents too. All the people I thought I could count on had let me down. For the first time in my life, I felt completely alone, and I had no idea how to move forward. I knew I couldn't avoid the house forever. As much as I wanted to burn it to the ground and walk away, I needed my things. Clothes, important papers, mementos of a life I thought was mine. It all still sat in the house where Jake and Emma were playing house. It wasn't just my stuff. It was a physical representation of everything I had worked for, everything I had lost. Leaving it all behind felt like letting them win. I spent days trying to psych myself up for the trip. Every time I thought about going back, a wave of nausea hit me. I kept imagining walking into some idyllic scene. Jake and Emma laughing together, sitting on my couch, eating dinner at my table, pretending I didn't exist. The thought made my blood boil, but the longer I put it off, the worse it would be. When I finally parked outside the house, my stomach churned. The place looked different even from the outside. The curtains Emma had changed were the first reminder that this wasn't my home anymore. As I walked up the driveway, I noticed Jake's sneakers on the porch, neatly placed where mine used to sit. A lump formed in my throat, but I pushed it down and rang the doorbell. I didn't expect them to answer together, but when the door opened, it was just Jake. He looked surprised, like he hadn't expected me to come back so soon. "Matt," he said, his voice awkward. "Hey, what are you doing here?" I stared at him for a moment, trying to decide whether to answer or just shove past him. Finally, I said, "I'm here for my stuff." "Oh," he said, stepping aside. "Yeah, of course. Come in." Walking through that door felt like walking into enemy territory. The air was heavy, like it carried the weight of their betrayal. Jake followed me into the living room, where he sat down on the couch like it was his throne. He watched me, fidgeting with his hands, clearly uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to leave. As I headed for the stairs, he called out, "Hey, are you okay?" That was the moment I snapped. I turned around so fast that he flinched. "Am I okay?" I said, my voice rising with every word. "No, Jake, I'm not okay. I came back from deployment to find out my brother stole my wife and moved into my house. Why the hell would I be okay?" He looked down, avoiding my eyes. "Matt, I'm sorry, man. I didn't mean—" "Don't you dare say you didn't mean for this to happen," I yelled, cutting him off. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You didn't just trip and fall into her bed, Jake. You made a choice. Both of you did. I know I screwed up," he said, his voice cracking. "But I didn't want to lose you. You're my brother, and I—" "Don't," I said, shaking my head. "Don't call me your brother. You're not my brother anymore. You're dead to me." That hit him hard. His eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought he might start sobbing. He opened his mouth to say something, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned and stormed up the stairs, leaving him sitting there like the pathetic coward he was. When I reached the bedroom, the sight of it stopped me in my tracks. It looked almost the same, but something was off. The bed was unmade, the sheets different from the ones I remembered. One of Jake's shirts was draped over the chair in the corner, and his cologne lingered in the air. It was like walking into an alternate universe where my life had been rewritten without my permission. I started grabbing my things, throwing them into a suitcase as quickly as I could. Every item I touched felt tainted. The clothes I had worn on dates with Emma, the watch she had given me for our anniversary, the framed photo of us from our honeymoon. They all felt meaningless now. As I packed, I noticed something odd. Some of my belongings were missing. A leather jacket Emma had always liked, a pair of sunglasses I had left on the dresser, even a few books. They were nowhere to be found. It was as if Jake and Emma had erased parts of me from the house, making room for their new life together. I could hear Jake downstairs, pacing back and forth. Every so often, he would call out, "Matt, can we talk?" I ignored him. Emma, on the other hand, stayed silent. I half expected her to come upstairs, to try to explain herself, or at least pretend to apologize, but she never did. I imagined her sitting in the kitchen, too cowardly to face me. Maybe she thought Jake would handle it, or maybe she just didn't care. Either way, her absence spoke volumes. By the time I finished packing, I felt completely drained. I had spent years building a life with Emma, and now I was leaving it all behind in a few hastily packed bags. As I carried the suitcase downstairs, Jake stood up, his face red and puffy from crying. "Matt, please," he said, blocking the door. "I know you hate me right now, but I can't lose you. You're my brother. We can get past this." I stared at him, wondering how he could be so delusional. "Get past this?" I said, my voice cold. "There's no getting past this, Jake. You destroyed our family. You destroyed me. I can't forgive you, and I don't want to." He stepped aside, tears streaming down his face. I opened the door and walked out without looking back. As I loaded my suitcase into the car, I realized something. Leaving the house felt like closing a chapter, but it didn't feel like freedom. It felt like defeat. Everything I had built, everything I had fought for, was still in that house, tainted by their betrayal. And no matter how far I drove, I couldn't leave that behind. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where I was going or what I was going to do next. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there, in that town, surrounded by people who had let me down. So I started the engine and drove, letting the road stretch out in front of me, hoping it would lead me to a place where I could start over. A few days after I left the house, I found myself sitting in the dingy motel room I had reluctantly called home. My suitcase sat in the corner, half unpacked, while piles of paperwork and items from my life with Emma cluttered the small desk. I had thrown everything into bags as quickly as possible, but now that I had time to unpack, I realized just how much I had taken and how much I had left behind. Among the mess was Emma's old laptop. At first, I didn't even recognize it. It was shoved into the side pocket of a bag, forgotten in the chaos of packing. I pulled it out, intending to set it aside for her, but then a thought struck me. Was it really hers? We both had similar laptops, and with everything going on, I couldn't remember if this one was mine or not. I powered it on, expecting to see her usual desktop wallpaper, a photo of us from some trip or holiday. Instead, the screen loaded with a generic background, and the username Emma popped up. It was hers. For a moment, I thought about closing it and forgetting I'd ever seen it. Snooping wasn't my thing, and I didn't want to sink to their level. But something nagged at me, a gut feeling that there was more to the story than they'd admitted. I opened her email out of curiosity, just to see if there was anything there about me or our life together. At first, everything seemed normal. Receipts, newsletters, and some conversations with friends. But then I noticed a folder labeled Archives. It wasn't a folder Emma normally used, and something about it felt off. When I clicked on it, my heart stopped. The first email I saw was from Jake. It wasn't recent. In fact, the timestamp showed it had been sent over a year ago, months before I left for deployment. My hands trembled as I opened it, unsure of what I was about to read. The email started innocently enough, but as I scrolled, the tone shifted. Jake was flirting with her, subtly at first, but growing bolder as the email went on. He mentioned missing their talks and how much he enjoyed spending time alone with her. Then, near the end, he wrote something that sent a chill down my spine. I can't wait to see you again. Let's make sure Matt doesn't find out. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't just a fling that happened while I was gone. This was premeditated. Jake had been scheming to get close to Emma while I was still home, and she had gone along with it. I sat there for a moment, staring at the screen, my mind racing. I clicked on another email, then another, each one worse than the last. In one, Jake talked about how things would be easier once I was deployed. In another, Emma responded with a coy, "You're bad, but I like it." It was like a punch to the gut. All this time, I had blamed my deployment for driving them together. I had thought maybe they were lonely, that they found comfort in each other in my absence. But now I saw the truth. This wasn't about loneliness. This was a betrayal that had been in the works for over a year. I kept scrolling, each email like another knife in my back. They talked about meeting up when I wasn't around, using my schedule to their advantage. Jake even mentioned helping Emma with bills while I was gone, as if he were already positioning himself to replace me. The worst part was how casual they were about it, as if they didn't care about the damage they were causing. Finally, I reached an email that made my blood boil. Jake had written it just days before I left for deployment. In it, he said, "Once Matt's gone, we can finally stop sneaking around. I know this isn't easy, but I promise it'll be worth it. You and me, we're meant to be." I slammed the laptop shut, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't read anymore. The betrayal was deeper than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just about Emma falling for someone else or Jake crossing a line. This was calculated. They had conspired to destroy my marriage and my trust long before I ever stepped on that plane. The realization hit me like a freight train. I had been living a lie for over a year. Every moment I spent with Emma before deployment, every kiss, every laugh, it was all tainted. She had been lying to my face while planning a future with my own brother. For a while, I just sat there staring at the laptop, trying to make sense of it all. How could they do this? How could Jake, the brother I had grown up with, betray me so completely? And Emma, the woman I had vowed to spend my life with. How could she look me in the eye every day, knowing what she was doing? The anger that surged through me was unlike anything I had ever felt before. I wanted to confront them, to scream at them, to make them feel even a fraction of the pain they had caused me. But what would that accomplish? They didn't care. If they did, they wouldn't have done this in the first place. I opened the laptop again, my hands shaking. Part of me wanted to forward the emails to my parents to show them just how deep this betrayal went. But then I stopped myself. What good would it do? My parents had already made their choice. They had sided with Jake and Emma, choosing to ignore their actions for the sake of keeping the peace. Instead, I copied the emails onto a flash drive. I didn't know why I was saving them, but I couldn't just let them sit there. Maybe I'd need them someday, for closure, or maybe just as a reminder to never let my guard down again. As I closed the laptop and shoved it back into the bag, a sense of clarity washed over me. This wasn't just betrayal, it was war. Jake and Emma had taken everything from me. My home, my marriage, my family. But they hadn't taken my dignity, and I wasn't going to let them win. I didn't know what my next move was, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. In the days following my discovery of those emails, something inside me hardened. It was as if the last thread tethering me to the idea of reconciliation with any of them had snapped. There was no fixing this, no salvaging my relationships, my family, or my life as I'd known it. The betrayal wasn't just a moment of weakness or a mistake. It was deliberate, orchestrated, and prolonged. I couldn't live with that. The first thing I did was block Jake and Emma on every platform imaginable. I didn't want to see their names pop up on my phone, didn't want to hear their weak apologies or pathetic justifications. Blocking them was easier than I thought, like slamming a door I should have closed long ago. Next, I called my parents. I hadn't planned to. In fact, I wasn't sure I wanted to speak to them ever again. But as much as I wanted to ghost them and leave them to stew in the mess they helped create, I needed to make my position crystal clear. They needed to hear the words directly from me. My mom picked up on the first ring. "Matt," she said, her voice thick with relief. "Thank God. I've been so worried about you. I know things are hard right now, but we can work through this." "Stop," I said, cutting her off. "I'm not calling to work through anything. I'm done, Mom. Done with Jake, done with Emma, and done with you and Dad." There was a long silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was trembling. "Matt, don't say that. We're your family. We love you. Family doesn't let this happen," I said, my voice cold. "Family doesn't stand by while your brother and your wife stab you in the back. You knew what they were doing, and you said nothing. You chose them over me." "That's not fair," she protested. "We didn't choose anyone. We were just trying to keep the peace." "You chose silence," I snapped. "And silence is the same as support. You sided with them when you decided to stay quiet. So don't call me and pretend like you're the victim here." "Matt, please," she said, starting to cry. "You can't cut us out like this. We're your parents." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. I'm done. Don't call me. Don't text me. Don't expect me to show up for holidays or birthdays. As far as I'm concerned, I don't have a family anymore." Before she could say anything else, I hung up. My hands were shaking, and I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Cutting ties wasn't easy, but it was necessary. The next step was finding a lawyer. I didn't want to deal with the divorce any longer than I had to. I didn't care about the house, the furniture, or any of the assets we had shared. I just wanted out. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Karen, seemed surprised by how little I wanted to fight for. "Are you sure you don't want to push for a better settlement?" she asked during our initial meeting. "With the infidelity, you have a solid case for her." "I don't care," I interrupted. "I don't want anything from her. I just want this over with." Karen nodded, though I could tell she thought I was making a mistake. "Fair enough. But if you change your mind, let me know. It's your right to take what's owed to you." The paperwork moved quickly, which was both a blessing and a curse. Each signature, each form I filled out, felt like another nail in the coffin of the life I'd built. By the time I filed the final documents, I felt like I had aged 10 years. Meanwhile, Jake wasn't making things easy. Despite being blocked on every platform, he found ways to reach me. He used different phone numbers to send texts, all of which I deleted without reading. One night, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered out of habit, and as soon as I heard his voice, I regretted it. "Matt, it's me," Jake said, sounding desperate. "Please don't hang up. I just need to talk to you." I didn't say anything, but he took my silence as permission to continue. "I know I screwed up," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I miss you, man. You're my brother. I can't lose you over this." I laughed bitterly. "You lost me the moment you decided my wife was fair game. What did you think was going to happen, Jake? That we'd all sit around the Thanksgiving table and laugh about it someday?" "I didn't want this to happen," he said. "I didn't mean—" "Stop," I said sharply. Don't say you didn't mean for this to happen. You had months to stop yourself, and you didn't. So don't insult me by pretending this was some accident. I miss you, he said again, like that was supposed to mean something. Well, I don't miss you, I replied. Don't call me again. I hung up and immediately blocked the number, but the conversation stuck with me. Jake's audacity was mind-boggling. He had destroyed my marriage, my family, and my trust, and yet he still thought he deserved a place in my life. As the weeks went on, I began to settle into a new routine. I moved to a small apartment on the other side of town, started going to the gym regularly, and threw myself into work. It wasn't much, but it was something. I stopped answering calls from anyone connected to my old life, determined to start fresh. For the first time in years, I was alone. It was a strange feeling, equal parts liberating and terrifying. But as painful as it was to cut ties with everyone I'd once called family, I knew it was the only way forward. They had chosen their path, and now I was choosing mine. Packing up my old life wasn't easy, but it felt like the only way to breathe again. I couldn't stay in the same town, constantly looking over my shoulder for reminders of what I'd lost. Every street felt haunted. Every cafe, every park, every familiar corner held memories of a time when I thought my life was stable, happy, and real. It wasn't real, though. It had been an illusion, shattered by people who were supposed to care about me. I decided to move to a different state entirely. A place where no one knew me, no one whispered about what happened, and no one looked at me with pity in their eyes. I used my GI Bill benefits to enroll in a community college and rented a modest apartment just outside the city. The apartment was small and unremarkable, but it was mine, free from the ghosts of my past. At first, everything felt surreal, like I was walking through someone else's life. I didn't know anyone. My days were quiet and empty, filled with long stretches of solitude that gave my thoughts too much space to wander. I missed the idea of family more than the reality of it. For all their faults, my parents had always been a constant in my life, and the loss of that connection left a void. The hardest part was convincing myself to stop checking my phone. Even though I had blocked Jake and Emma, a part of me still hoped for, I don't know what, an apology? A sign that they were miserable without me? My therapist later explained that it wasn't about wanting reconciliation. It was about wanting validation that I had mattered to them. Therapy was one of the best decisions I made during that time. It wasn't easy to admit I needed help, but I knew I couldn't rebuild my life on my own. My therapist, Dr. Hodge, was a calm and understanding woman who didn't sugarcoat things. She let me vent about the anger, the betrayal, the lingering pain of losing not just a wife but a brother and parents in one fell swoop. Early in our sessions, Dr. Hodge said something that stuck with me. Sometimes, the family you're born into isn't the family you keep. At first, her words felt like a slap in the face. I didn't want to accept that my family, my brother, my parents, was gone. But as time went on, I realized she was right. Family wasn't about blood. It was about trust, loyalty, and love. And those were things I'd never get from the people I'd left behind. To fill the void, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I went to classes during the day, worked part-time at a local hardware store in the evenings, and hit the gym every morning. The gym became a kind of sanctuary for me. The physical strain gave me a focus, a goal. Every drop of sweat felt like a small victory, a piece of the weight I carried being lifted. Slowly, I started making connections with people. My classmates were a mix of ages and backgrounds, and I gravitated toward a few who were closer to my age. There was Eric, a former Marine who was also adjusting to civilian life. Mia, a single mom studying to become a nurse. And Josh, a quiet but sharp-witted guy who always managed to lighten the mood. The friendships weren't instant, but over time, we started hanging out outside of class. They didn't pry too much into my past, which I appreciated. When I did share bits and pieces, they listened without judgment. One night, after a late study session at a coffee shop, Mia said something that hit me harder than I expected. You know, Matt, you're one of the most resilient people I've ever met. Whatever happened to you, you didn't let it break you. That's rare. I didn't respond right away. For so long, I'd felt like I was barely holding it together, but hearing someone else acknowledge my strength gave me a glimmer of hope. Therapy helped me process the anger I had been carrying. Dr. Hodge helped me see that forgiveness didn't mean letting Jake, Emma, or my parents back into my life. It meant letting go of the control their actions had over me. That was the hardest part, accepting that I couldn't change what had happened, no matter how much I replayed it in my head. One day, during a session, Dr. Hodge asked, if you woke up tomorrow and they were all gone, no Jake, no Emma, no parents, what would you do with your life? I sat there, stunned by the question. For so long, my thoughts had been consumed by what they had done to me. I hadn't even considered what life could look like without their shadow hanging over me. I'd probably keep doing what I'm doing now, I said finally. School, work, the gym, maybe travel someday. And how does that feel? She asked. I thought about it for a moment. It feels freeing. That was the turning point. I stopped focusing on what I'd lost and started focusing on what I could build. I gave myself permission to imagine a future that didn't include Jake, Emma, or my parents. It was a bittersweet realization, but it was also empowering. By the end of my first year in the new state, I felt more like myself than I had in a long time. I wasn't fully healed, far from it, but I was moving forward. I started journaling, documenting my progress, and setting goals for the future. One day, while cleaning out some old boxes, I found the flash drive with Jake and Emma's emails. For a moment, I considered reading them again, but then I stopped. Instead, I threw the flash drive into the trash. I didn't need it anymore. Their betrayal had defined me for too long, and I was done letting it control my life. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The weight of the past was still there, but it was lighter now, no longer holding me back. I didn't know exactly where life would take me, but I was ready to find out. It had been a year since I'd cut ties with my family and started fresh in a new state. By then, the wounds had started to scar over, though I couldn't say they were fully healed. I was focused on my own life, school, work, and the friendships I had built. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't living under the weight of betrayal. The ache was still there, but it had dulled enough that I could function without constantly looking back. So when I got a call from Eric, one of my newer friends, telling me he had bumped into a mutual acquaintance from my old life, my first instinct was to shut it down. I'm not interested, I said, already anticipating bad news. No, Eric said, chuckling. This is something you might actually want to hear. Trust me, curiosity got the better of me. Fine, I said. What is it? Well, apparently, your brother and Emma? Not doing so hot, Eric said. Word is, Jake cheated on her. I blinked, letting the words sink in. He cheated on her? Yup, Eric said. Some woman from his office, I think. Emma found out, and it was messy. She kicked him out. I sat back in my chair, unsure of how to process the information. For a moment, I didn't feel anything, just a hollow sort of surprise. Then, slowly, I felt a small flicker of something resembling satisfaction. Jake, the guy who had stolen my wife and thought he could waltz into my life without consequences, had screwed it all up. But as much as part of me wanted to revel in the karma of it all, another part of me just felt relieved. It wasn't my problem anymore. I didn't have to pick up the pieces, clean up the mess, or deal with the fallout. That was Jake's burden to bear. What's he doing now? I asked, more out of curiosity than concern. Eric laughed. Apparently, he's living with your parents. The guy can't catch a break. Hearing that Jake had moved back in with my parents was both unsurprising and, frankly, a little pathetic. I knew he had always relied on others to fix his problems, so of course he'd run back to mom and dad when things went south. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how poetic it was. My parents had bent over backward to defend Jake and Emma, begging me to forgive them for the sake of family. And now, the golden child they had chosen over me was back under their roof, dragging his mess with him. A few days later, I got another update, this time from Mia, one of my classmates who had stayed in touch with someone from my hometown. Your parents are struggling, she told me over coffee. Struggling how? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. Financially mostly, she said. Apparently, they were counting on you coming back to help with a few things, like the house. And now Jake isn't exactly stepping up. He's not even paying rent. I shook my head, almost laughing at the irony. My parents had begged me to forgive Jake and Emma, acting like I was the unreasonable one for walking away. Now, Jake was leeching off them while I was hundreds of miles away, rebuilding my life without their drama. Serves them right, I said, the bitterness slipping out before I could stop it. Mia raised an eyebrow. That doesn't sound like you. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I know. It's just they made their choice, you know? They wanted Jake. Well, now they've got him. True, she said, sipping her coffee. But it's still sad. It sounds like they miss you. That hit harder than I expected. As angry as I was, as justified as I felt in cutting ties, a part of me still missed my parents. They had raised me, after all. I had good memories of family dinners, holidays, and road trips. But those memories felt tainted now, overshadowed by their decision to stand by Jake and Emma instead of supporting me. Over the next few weeks, I found myself thinking about Jake and my parents more than I wanted to. I didn't feel sorry for Jake. He had dug his own grave, but I couldn't stop wondering how my parents were handling everything. Had they realized they'd made a mistake? Were they regretting the choices that had pushed me away? One evening, I got my answer. I was sitting in my apartment flipping through channels when my phone buzzed. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer. "Hello," I said cautiously. "Matt," my mom's voice came through the line, soft and hesitant. "It's me." I closed my eyes, bracing myself. "What do you want?" I wanted to hear your voice," she said. "We miss you." Her words stirred something in me, a mix of anger and longing. "You didn't miss me when Jake and Emma were tearing my life apart," I said coldly. "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I know we made mistakes. I know we hurt you. But things are falling apart here, Matt. Jake, he's not who he thought he was. And we need you." I almost laughed at the audacity of it. "You need me now? After everything? Please," she said, her voice desperate. "Just think about it. Come home, even for a visit. Let's talk. We can fix this." I let the silence stretch, letting her words sink in. Part of me wanted to hang up, to tell her I was done for good. But another part of me, the part that still craved closure, wanted to see her face to face, to confront her with everything she had done. "I'll think about it," I said finally. She exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath. "Thank you, Matt. That's all I ask." When I hung up, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I didn't know if I'd ever go back, but one thing was clear. Jake's downfall was just the beginning of the reckoning my family would face. And for once, I wasn't the one carrying the burden. The call from my mom lingered in my mind long after I hung up. It wasn't the first time she had reached out, but it was the first time she admitted they had been wrong. Hearing those words felt surreal. For over a year, I had carried the weight of their betrayal, convinced they didn't care about how deeply they had hurt me. Now, for the first time, it seemed like she understood. But what did that change? Could I trust that she truly meant it? Or was she only reaching out because Jake had failed them, and they had no one else to turn to? I had questions, doubts, and a mountain of anger that no single apology could erase. I spent the next few days wrestling with the decision. Part of me wanted to ignore her completely. I had built a life without them, a life where I didn't have to constantly question my worth or deal with the emotional fallout of their choices. Letting her back in felt risky, like opening a wound that had just started to heal. And yet, another part of me craved closure. Maybe it was the lingering hope that my family could still be repaired, or maybe it was just the need to finally say everything I had been holding back. Whatever it was, it gnawed at me until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I decided to call her back. The phone rang twice before she picked up, her voice instantly filled with cautious hope. "Matt," she said, as if she wasn't sure it was really me. "It's me," I said. "I've been thinking about what you said." "Oh, Matt," she breathed, relief spilling into her tone. "Thank you for calling. I've been praying you'd give us another chance." "Don't get ahead of yourself," I said, keeping my voice firm. "I'm not saying I'm ready to forgive you or come back. I need to understand why." "Why what?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why you chose Jake and Emma over me," I said bluntly. "Why you stood by and let them destroy my life." There was a long pause. I could hear her breathing, like she was trying to gather her thoughts. Finally, she said, "Matt, we didn't think we were choosing sides. At least, not at first. We thought if we stayed neutral, things would eventually work themselves out." "Neutral?" I repeated, the anger bubbling up again. "How is keeping their secret neutral? You knew what they were doing, and you didn't say a word to me. That's not neutrality. That's betrayal." "I know," she said softly. "Looking back, I see that now. But at the time, we thought we were protecting you. We thought if we could keep the peace, you'd come home, and everything would go back to normal." I let out a bitter laugh. "Normal? You thought I'd just come back and pretend everything was fine? That I wouldn't notice my wife and my brother had replaced me?" She didn't respond right away, and when she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I'm sorry, Matt. I know we failed you. We should have told you the truth, but we were scared. Scared of losing you. Scared of breaking the family apart." "The family was already broken," I said. "Jake and Emma broke it, and you let them. You didn't lose me because of the truth. You lost me because you chose their comfort over mine." "I know," she whispered, "and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." Her apology sounded genuine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. Words were easy. Actions were what mattered, and so far, their actions had shown me where I stood in their priorities. "What do you want from me?" I asked after a long silence. "Why are you calling now?" "Because I miss you," she said simply. "Because your father and I made mistakes, and we want to make things right. I know it'll take time, but we're willing to do whatever it takes. Please, Matt, give us a chance to fix this." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. I could hear the desperation in her voice, the cracks in her usual composed demeanor. Part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that they had finally seen the error of their ways. But another part of me, the part that had spent the past year picking up the pieces of my life, couldn't let go of the pain so easily. "I'll think about it," I said finally. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking with relief. "That's all I ask." After we hung up, I sat in my apartment, staring at the wall. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Forgiveness was supposed to be freeing, but the idea of letting them back into my life felt more like a trap. Over the next few days, I spent a lot of time reflecting on what forgiveness really meant. Was it about absolving them of their guilt, letting them off the hook for what they'd done? Or was it about freeing myself from the anger and resentment that had consumed me for so long? During my next therapy session, I brought it up with Dr. Hodge. What if forgiving them means they think everything's okay? I asked. What if they use it as an excuse to sweep everything under the rug? "Forgiveness isn't about them," she said. "It's about you. It's about letting go of the control their actions have over your life. You don't have to let them back in to forgive them. And you certainly don't have to forget what they did." Her words stuck with me. For so long, I had equated forgiveness with reconciliation, but maybe it didn't have to be that way. Maybe I could forgive them for my own sake, not theirs. In the end, I decided to take things one step at a time. I wasn't ready to fully rebuild my relationship with my parents, but I wasn't ready to shut the door completely either. I called my mom back and told her I was open to a conversation, but I made it clear that trust would take time, if it ever came back at all. She agreed, and for the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. In the months following my mom's apology, I wrestled with the idea of what family really meant. Growing up, I had always been told that family was sacred, that no matter what happened, you stuck together. But after everything I'd been through, I realized that wasn't true. Family isn't about blood or tradition. It's about trust, loyalty, and mutual respect. Without those things, family is just a word. I kept my distance from Jake and Emma, a decision that felt less like a choice and more like a necessity. There was no version of reality where I could let them back into my life. Forgiving them might have freed me from my anger, but it didn't mean I had to subject myself to their presence. They had made their choices, and I had made mine. As for my parents, the dynamic was more complicated. My mom called every couple of weeks, and sometimes I'd pick up. Our conversations were cautious, like walking on a tightrope stretched over years of pain. She asked about my life, about school, about the new friends I had made, and I answered politely but briefly. She also asked if I'd consider coming home for the holidays, but I always declined. "I'm not ready," I'd say, though the truth was that I might never be ready. The idea of sitting at a table where Jake and Emma's betrayal had been swept under the rug made my stomach churn. My dad reached out less often, but when he did, his calls were even harder to handle. He didn't apologize outright. He never had, but I could hear the regret in his voice. He asked me about work, about the classes I was taking, and about my plans for the future. He never brought up Jake or Emma, almost as if avoiding their names might erase their existence from our history. One day, I received a package in the mail from my parents. Inside was a framed photo of me as a kid, standing between my mom and dad at some long-forgotten family barbecue. There was also a letter. "Dear Matt, we know we can't undo the pain we've caused you, and we don't expect forgiveness overnight. But we want you to know that we're proud of the man you've become, and we're sorry for the ways we failed you. We miss you more than words can say, and we hope that someday we can all find a way back to each other. Love, Mom and Dad." I stared at the letter for a long time. Part of me wanted to crumple it up and toss it in the trash, but another part, the part that still missed the parents I used to know, kept me from doing it. Instead, I put it in a drawer alongside the few other keepsakes from my old life that I hadn't been able to part with. As time went on, I began to truly embrace the life I had built for myself. My classes were going well, and I had started thinking about transferring to a 4-year university to finish my degree. The friends I had made had become like family to me. Eric, Mia, and Josh were my constants, the people I could count on no matter what. I also started volunteering at a local veterans organization, helping others who were struggling to adjust to civilian life. It was a way to give back, but it also gave me a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. One evening, as I was packing up after a volunteer event, Eric pulled me aside. "You've come a long way. You know that?" he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "Yeah?" I asked, smiling faintly. "Yeah," he said. "When I first met you, you were like a shell of yourself. Now, you're a different guy. A better one. His words stayed with me. For so long, I had defined myself by what I had lost: my wife, my brother, my family. But now, I realized I was more than that. I wasn't just someone who had been betrayed. I was someone who had survived it, grown from it, and come out stronger on the other side. One day, while sitting on the porch of my apartment with a cup of coffee, I thought back to something Dr. Hodge had told me during one of our sessions. Sometimes, the best thing you can do for yourself is walk away. Not out of anger, but out of love. For yourself and for the life you want to live. Those words had felt harsh at the time, but now they made sense. Walking away from Jake, Emma, and even my parents wasn't about punishment. It was about self-preservation. I deserved to live a life free from the shadow of their betrayal. In the end, I chose not to reconnect with Jake or Emma. They didn't deserve a place in the life I had rebuilt. As for my parents, I kept them at arm's length. I answered their calls occasionally, sent polite replies to their messages, but I made it clear that I wasn't coming home for holidays or pretending everything was fine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Free from the anger, free from the resentment, and free to create the life I wanted. People always say that family is everything, but I've learned that isn't true. Family isn't defined by blood or tradition. It's defined by the people who stand by you, who support you, and who respect you. Sometimes, the family you're born into isn't the family you keep. And that's okay, because sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away.